The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of glass fracturing the intense final battle of Lord of 10,000 Swords. Artyom did not blink. He traced the lines of the ink, his thumb hovering over the last panel where the hero stood amidst the ruins of a fallen kingdom. The blue light of the display was the only thing holding the darkness of his room at bay. He read the final attack sequence again, his mind mapping every stroke, every trajectory of the blades. Then, the text began to swim. It was not the screen failing, it was his own focus. He leaned in closer, his breath hitching as the sharp edges of the panels started to bleed into one another. The room felt suddenly hollow, the air growing thick and static-charged. He tried to shake the heaviness from his head, but his balance betrayed him. A sharp, stinging pressure built behind his eyes, and the world shifted on its axis. He took a single, unsteady step toward the light of the hallway, but the floor beneath him seemed to tilt, turning the solid ground into something treacherous and unfamiliar. The phone slipped from his grip, the light fading into a blur of gray. He lunged for the handrail, but his fingers caught nothing but empty air. The hallway floor did not feel like wood anymore. It felt like shifting sand. His momentum carried him forward, his center of gravity lost to the sudden tilt of the world. He tried to twist his body, to turn the fall into a roll, but his reflexes were sluggish, as if he were moving through deep water. The stairwell yawned open before him, a dark throat waiting to swallow his frantic movement. He hit the first step hard, his shin striking the edge with enough force to jar his teeth. He did not stop there. He tumbled, shoulders scraping against the rough drywall, his head whipping toward the sharp corner of the lower landing. Time seemed to snap into a singular point of focus. He saw the edge of the stairwell, a jagged protrusion of wood and plaster, rushing toward his temple. There was no pain, only a sudden, jarring stop. The sound of his own breath vanished. His vision, already blurred, collapsed into a pinprick of white light. The darkness that followed was absolute, heavy, and final. He was no longer in the hallway. He was no longer anywhere at all. Consciousness returned not as a gradual light, but as a violent assault on the senses. The first thing he registered was the air. It was thick, heavy, and carried the biting stench of wet charcoal and deep, stagnant rot. Artyom tried to inhale, but the air felt abrasive in his throat. He pushed his palms against the ground, expecting the smooth surface of his hallway floor, but his hands pressed into gritty, uneven earth. He forced his eyes open. The world was a narrow, suffocating corridor of shadow, flanked by towering wooden structures that seemed to lean inward. Strange, jagged symbols were carved deep into the wood, catching the faint, sickly light that filtered from somewhere far above. He tried to scramble to his feet, but his legs spasmed, buckling under him. He hit the ground again, his breath hitching in a sharp, jagged rhythm. There was no sound of distant traffic, no hum of electronics, only the dripping of liquid somewhere in the darkness and the sound of his own frantic, shallow gasps. He pressed his back against the rough, splintered wall of a hut, his hands trembling as he stared into the void of the alley. The terror was a cold weight in his chest, absolute and suffocating. He was not in his home. He was not even in his own world. Artyom forced his shaking fingers to unclench. He pushed himself away from the wall, his boots scraping against the uneven dirt floor. He turned his gaze toward the wooden huts, finally focusing on the marks he had previously dismissed as mere shadows. These were not random scuffs. They were carvings. Deep, jagged strokes bitten into the timber in precise, rhythmic patterns. He reached out, his skin brushing the rough grain of the wood. The calligraphy was sharp, cruel, and distinctly non-human in its geometry. He followed the flow of the symbols with his eyes, but they refused to resolve into any recognizable language. A sudden hollow ringing bloomed at the base of his skull. He pulled his hand back, his pulse thundering against his skin. This was not a dream born of a concussion. The architecture, the oppressive layout of the alley, the very texture of the air, it all matched the descriptions he had memorized for years. He looked up, tracing the line of the buildings until they met a sliver of dark, starless sky. The realization settled into his bones like ice. Every detail confirmed the impossibility. It was not just in a new place. He was inside the logic of a machine. The walls seemed to vibrate with a low, barely audible frequency, as if the entire city were waiting for a command. The vibration grew more violent, shifting from a low hum to a rhythmic thrum that rattled his teeth. Artyom pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound was internal, echoing directly against the bone. Then, it happened. A sharp, piercing mechanical chime rang out, cutting through the heavy, stagnant air like a razor. It was the exact tone he had heard thousands of times through his phone speakers. He flinched, his eyes darting toward the source, but there was nothing there. Silence rushed back in, thicker than before. He stood frozen, his breath hitching in his chest, waiting for the echo to die. Instead, the air in front of his eyes began to shimmer. Particles of light gathered in the darkness, knitting together with impossible speed. A translucent blue panel snapped into existence, hovering inches from his face. It cast a cold, sterile glow onto the splintered wood of the huts, illuminating the jagged symbols with a sharp, clinical clarity. The display flickered, the surface rippling like disturbed water. Bold, glowing text began to etch itself across the interface. He stared, his vision locking onto the first word. It was a greeting, precise and terrifyingly familiar. A prompt pulsed in the center of the screen, demanding his attention, marking the moment his world ended and the game began. The text on the blue panel burned with a steady, unforgiving light. Artyom squinted, his mind struggling to process the shifting characters as they locked into place. "Welcome, player. Knowledge system activated." He read the words aloud, his voice cracking in the suffocating silence of the alley. Below the greeting, a new line materialized, pulsing with a rhythmic crimson glow. Current vessel, Wei Chen, 19, rankless, time until death, 3 days. The air left his lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. He stumbled backward, his heels catching on a loose stone, and he hit the wall hard. The impact sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder, but he barely registered it. His eyes remained fixed on the glowing timer, which had already begun its relentless descent. 3 days. He blinked, but the numbers did not vanish. They stood as an absolute, immutable fact, etched into his field of vision. A cold, heavy weight settled in his gut, replacing his confusion with a sharp, piercing dread. He looked down at his own hands, turning them over in the pale blue light of the interface. They were not his own. They were the hands of a stranger, a ghost trapped in a narrative he knew too well. The countdown ticked down another second, a silent, mechanical heartbeat marking the rhythm of his own extinction. The system interface remained suspended in the air, its blue light reflecting in his wide, unblinking eyes. Wei Chen. The name pulled a trigger in his mind. He did not just recognize it. He saw the ink-stained panels of a digital comic flickering behind his eyelids. Lord of 10,000 Swords. Every chapter, every frame, every tragedy he had consumed on his phone screen now surfaced with brutal clarity. He navigated his own memory like a library, flipping past the heroes and the legendary blades to find the forgotten footnotes. There, Chapter 1. A nameless extra, a background face in a crowded market square, slaughtered by the Black Raven gang to prove their malice. He saw the panels again, the cold steel, the sudden spray of color, the way the protagonist barely looked down at the body before walking away. His heart skipped a beat, then hammered against his ribs with frantic intensity. He was not the hero. He was the setup. He was the opening kill, the red ink spilled to fuel someone else's legend. The realization arrived not as a thought, but as a physical blow, leaving him breathless and trembling in the damp, rotting shadows of the alleyway. His fingers dug into the rough, jagged stone of the wall until the grit bit into his skin. He needed this pain to be real, to ground him in something other than the nightmare of his own memory. Wei Chen. He whispered the name into the stagnant air, the syllables feeling foreign and sharp on his tongue. It was a name that meant nothing, a name that carried no weight, no history, no future. He shook his head, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. There had to be a mistake. This was a glitch, a fever dream born from the impact against the stairwell. He closed his eyes tight, waiting for the familiar hum of his phone or the ceiling of his room, but the smell of charcoal and wet rot remained. When he opened his eyes, the blue system panel was still there, hovering with clinical, indifferent precision. He was not the protagonist. He was not the one who would rise to power. He was the sacrifice, The expendable. He pressed his forehead against the cold wall, his entire body trembling as the absurdity of his death sentence collided with the hard, unyielding reality of the alley. He was trapped in the opening act of a tragedy, and his only role was to cease existing. The blue panel pulsed, casting a rhythmic, sickly light over his knuckles. Words carved themselves into the empty air. Quest. Survive until dawn. Reward. 100 knowledge points. He stared at the glowing text, his vision tunneling until nothing remained but those letters. Survive. The word tasted like iron. It was not a grand challenge or a hero's quest. It was a baseline requirement for a creature marked for disposal. He reached out, his fingers passing through the light, feeling only a faint hum of static against his skin. This was not a dream he could wake from. This was a clock ticking down. He looked at the alleyway exit, where the first gray light of evening began to bleed into the sky. If he stayed here, he was a corpse. If he moved, he was a target. He pushed himself off the wall, his legs feeling heavy and uncertain, and took a single, deliberate step toward the market. The air grew colder. The system flickered once, then settled into a steady, predatory glow. Every second was now a calculation. Every breath was a gamble. He had 3 days, but he had to make it through the next 12 hours first. He gripped his hands into fists and stepped into the open street, eyes wide, searching for the shadows he knew were coming. The market was a wall of sound. Voices clashed in a frantic, dissonant harmony as vendors barked prices and carts groaned over uneven ground. Artyom pressed into the throng, his shoulder colliding with a passerby, but he did not stop to apologize. He was looking for markers. He was looking for the world he had memorized in thousands of panels. The scent of roasted meat and damp spice hung heavy, thick enough to coat his throat. He pushed past a group of arguing laborers, his eyes darting across every face, every stall, every crooked timber support. He needed a reference point. He needed to see the blueprint of the narrative manifest in this physical space. For a moment, the sheer density of the crowd overwhelmed him. He was shoved into a wooden pillar, the breath knocked from his lungs. He gasped, hands gripping the post to keep from falling as the world spun. He steadied himself, shaking off the disorientation. He ignored the people. He ignored the noise. He focused on the geometry of the street, the specific placement of the stalls, and the way the shadows fell against the brickwork. He was not just a survivor here. He was an observer of a script he already knew by heart. Artyom pulled his focus from the chaotic noise of the crowd and narrowed his gaze onto the stalls ahead. His heart rate steadied. He was not just guessing, he was recalling. Near the corner of the main thoroughfare, a man stood behind a wooden crate piled high with cabbages. The merchant was broad-shouldered and loud, shouting his prices with a rhythmic, grating inflection. Artyom recognized the man instantly. In the 3rd chapter of the manga, this merchant provided a brief, slapstick moment that broke the tension of the scene. He remembered the exact panel. The merchant would pivot, lose his balance, and send his entire inventory spilling across the cobblestones. It was a fixed point in his memory, a reliable anchor of causality. A smirk touched Artyom's lips. If this world followed the script he had studied, he could predict everything. He felt a sharp, intoxicating rush of certainty. He was no longer a victim trapped in a hostile environment. He was a reader holding the keys to the narrative. He watched the merchant begin his pivot, his legs already shifting in anticipation of the familiar stumble. Artyom leaned forward, his eyes locked on the loose, uneven stone near the man's heel. The moment was coming. The script was playing out exactly as it should. Artyom counted the seconds in his head. 3, 2, 1. He watched the merchant's heavy boot lift, hovering directly over the jagged, raised cobblestone that had served as the pivot point in the manga. He braced for the sound of wood splintering, for the frantic scramble of produce hitting the dirt, for the entire street to erupt in the chaos he had memorized. But the boot descended and settled firmly on the other side. The merchant didn't stumble. He didn't even break his stride. He continued walking, whistling a sharp, upbeat tune that cut through the ambient noise of the market like a blade. Artyom blinked, his eyes darting to the stone, then back to the merchant's receding back. The man disappeared into the crowd, completely unbothered, his inventory perfectly intact. A low, synthetic hum vibrated in Artyom's skull. A bright blue panel flickered into existence before his eyes, its edges glowing with a cold, unforgiving light. The text shifted, the characters bleeding into a harsh, warning red. It read, -10 knowledge points. Incorrect prediction. Artyom stood frozen, the air rushing out of his lungs. The script was not a map. It was a lie. The crimson light burned into his vision, a digital stain on the world around him. 10 points gone. Just like that. Artyom stared at the empty space where the merchant had been, his mind racing to find an error in his own logic. He replayed the scene from the manga, frame by frame, searching for a missed detail or a different angle. Every scene was fixed. Every movement was choreographed. He had studied these pages until the ink blurred, trusting them as absolute truth. But the cobblestones here were real, and they stayed put when the merchant stepped over them. He felt the weight of his own ignorance. The system pulsed again, a cold, rhythmic reminder of his failure. Artyom turned toward a wooden post supporting the market awning and slammed his fist against it. The rough timber bit into his knuckles, a sharp, grounding pain that did nothing to settle his nerves. He ignored the stinging in his hand and glared at the flickering blue interface. In the manga, he trips, he snapped, his voice barely rising above the market din. He always trips! The logic of the story had been his only weapon, his only shield in this hostile city. If the script could fail him here, in a simple, trivial event, then nothing was guaranteed. The foundation of his confidence cracked under the pressure of the unknown. The system did not offer sympathy. It did not flicker or lag. It simply processed his outburst as data. A new line of text scrolled onto the blue panel, the letters appearing with rhythmic precision. The manga is a script, the system stated. Reality is a living variable. Artyom stared, his breathing ragged, his hands still throbbing from the impact with the post. He tried to force the words into a frame he understood, but they resisted. He had lived his life by the logic of panels and ink, where every action had a predefined result, and every character followed a set path. Now, the ground beneath his feet felt less solid, less certain. The market around him, the shouting vendors, the heavy smell of damp earth and rotting produce, the chaotic movement of the crowd no longer looked like a background illustration. It looked like a machine in motion, one that didn't care about his knowledge. The system pulsed, a soft, indifferent white. Every choice made by every inhabitant of this world created new outcomes, it continued. Your memories are static. The world is fluid. Artyom leaned back against the post, his legs feeling heavy. The security he had felt, the arrogance of knowing what would happen next, vanished. He was no longer an observer reading a book. He was a piece of debris caught in a storm that he could no longer predict. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, dragging the warmth from the alleyways and replacing it with a damp, creeping chill. Artyom watched the light fail, the orange glow retreating from the rooftops like blood draining from a wound. Every shadow grew longer, stretching across the cobblestones until the market was nothing but a maze of dark, unreadable shapes. His heart rhythm changed. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a countdown. Midnight. The script was absolute about the time of his death. The Black Ravens would come for Wei Chen, and the system would be there to record the end. He wiped his palms on his legs, feeling the rough fabric, and walked toward the east gate. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of wet stone and the metallic tang of impending violence. He stopped near the shadows of the warehouse, his eyes scanning the gloom. The system pulsed a faint, warning blue. Time until death, mere hours. Artyom pressed his back against a cold wall, his breath hitching in the sudden silence. He was no longer waiting for a story to unfold. He was waiting for a killer to emerge from the dark, and for the first time, he had no idea if he would survive the next sunrise. The east gate felt like a tomb he had arrived at too early. Artyom turned away, his boots scraping against the uneven stone as he drifted into the labyrinth of the lower district. The city was changing. Merchants were shuttering their stalls with heavy wooden bars, and the streetlights flickered to life a dim, sickly yellow glow that did little to push back the encroaching dark. He walked past a group of laborers hunched over a bowl of thin broth. They did not look up. They did not speak. To them, he was merely another shadow passing in the gloom, a nameless face in a city of thousands. He reached out to touch a rough brick wall, feeling the cold, damp grit under his fingertips. The sensation was real, yet he felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a stage. He was the protagonist of his own terror, but to this world, he was barely a footnote. He caught his reflection in a rain barrel, a distorted, dark blur. No one would mourn if he vanished tonight. The system remained silent, a cold, weightless presence in his mind. He was utterly alone, wandering through a narrative that had already decided his expiration date, waiting for a clock that only he could hear ticking. The road led back to the east gate, a circular path that felt more like a closing noose. Artyom stopped where the massive iron-bound doors met the city wall. This was the spot, the exact coordinate where the story demanded his end. He looked at the cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of traffic, and traced the path the Black Raven gang would take. To his left, a stack of rotting crates provided the perfect cover for an ambush. To his right, a narrow drainage ditch offered no escape. He was trapped in a stage set he knew by heart. He paced the perimeter, his boots crunching on loose gravel, searching for a flaw in the script. There was none. The architecture itself conspired against him, funneling his movement into the center of the gate. He reached out to touch the cold, damp stone of the archway, feeling the rough texture bite into his skin. It was solid, unyielding, a reality that refused to bend for his sake. He stood in the center of the threshold, his gaze locked on the darkness beyond the gate, and waited. The wind whistled through the gaps in the wood, sounding like a sharpening blade. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, standing in the mouth of his own execution. The silence of the east gate began to hum with a rhythm that was not his own. Artyom pressed his palms against his chest, feeling the frantic, uneven thudding of his heart against his ribs. It was a rapid, stuttering beat, the drum of a man facing his final chapter. He checked the internal clock flickering in his mind. 2 minutes until midnight. The air grew heavy, smelling of ozone and damp earth. His lungs burned with every shallow breath, and he forced himself to inhale slowly, counting the seconds to keep his limbs from shaking. He reached down and gripped a jagged stone from the ground, the sharp edge digging into his palm until the sting cut through his mounting terror. This pain was necessary. It was the only thing anchoring him to the present, proving he was not just a sequence of lines on a screen. He watched the shadows deepen, his eyes darting toward the warehouse entrance where the gang would emerge. His pulse surged, a rhythmic pounding that vibrated through his entire frame. He was no longer observing a story. He was the center of it. Every muscle in his legs tensed, coiled, and ready to snap. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and locked his gaze on the darkness. The time was almost here. The clock in his mind hit 0. The silence of the night deepened, waiting for the violence that the script had guaranteed. Artyom stayed exactly where he was. In the original story, this was the moment he should have turned and run, a pathetic reaction that ensured his demise. He felt the phantom pressure of the narrative urging him to move, to follow the path carved out for him by the manga panels. He shifted his weight, digging his heels into the dirt. A sudden, cold clarity washed over him. He was not a prop. He was not a character designed to be erased in the opening act to drive someone else's plot. He looked at his own hands, steady now, and clenched them into fists. The system flickered, waiting for his compliance, but he ignored the blue light. He took a breath, deep and deliberate, and exhaled the fear. If the world wanted a victim, it would have to find one elsewhere. He tilted his head, listening to the first sounds of movement from the dark warehouse. They were coming, just as predicted, but the ending was no longer written in stone. He would not go quietly. He would not be a footnote. He prepared himself to break the script and rewrite his own survival. He scanned the debris near the alley wall, his eyes searching for anything that could serve as a deterrent. His fingers brushed against a pile of refuse until they closed around a length of rusted pipe. He pulled it free, the metal scraping against stone with a harsh, grating sound. It was heavy, oxidized, and uneven, but it carried enough weight to crack bone. He swung it once, testing the balance. The pipe hummed through the air, dragging his arm with its momentum. He adjusted his grip, sliding his hand up toward the center to gain better control. His palms were slick with sweat, but they no longer trembled. He watched the rusted surface, noting the jagged edges where the metal had sheared off. This was his reality now. No more scripts, no more predetermined failures. He tucked the pipe against his side, feeling the cold iron bite into his palm. Every nerve in his body sharpened, shifting from the tremors of panic to the focused tension of a predator. He stepped out from behind the wall, his eyes locked onto the shadows where the threat lingered. The world demanded his death, but he had chosen his own terms. He was ready to fight for every second he had left. Artyom moved with practiced silence into the deep gloom of the warehouse exterior. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood and rotting grain. He pressed himself against the rough stone, minimizing his presence in the narrow gap between the wall and a stack of crates. He held his breath, forcing his heart rate to remain rhythmic. Every muscle in his legs felt coiled, ready to snap into motion at the slightest provocation. He tilted his head, his ears straining against the ambient noise of the sleeping city. A faint, rhythmic scraping sound emerged from the darkness ahead, the sound of hard-soled boots against gravel. It was closer than he had calculated, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. He shifted his weight, carefully placing his heel to avoid a loose board that threatened to betray him. The silence returned, taut and fragile, stretched thin between the impending violence and his own survival. He gripped the pipe, his knuckles turning white, and narrowed his eyes. The shadows were beginning to shift, coalescing into shapes that didn't belong. He was positioned perfectly, a ghost waiting for the prey to walk into his reach. Artyom watched the darkness, his eyes tracking the slight movement of air against the warehouse entrance. He knew this moment. He knew the sequence of events as clearly as if he were reading the panels before his eyes. His heart hammered a steady, frantic rhythm against his ribs, but he forced his voice down to a jagged whisper. He addressed the system directly, his words barely audible in the stagnant air. "They come from the shadows of the warehouse exactly at 12, he muttered, his fingers tightening around the cold metal of the pipe. This was the gamble. If the script held, he would be rewarded. If reality had shifted, he was walking into his own grave. He stared at the empty space between the crates, counting the seconds with his pulse. Each heartbeat felt like a hammer blow against his resolve. He leaned forward, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, muscles burning with the strain of absolute stillness. The darkness did not move, but the pressure in the alley intensified. He held his breath, waiting for the shadows to break, trusting in the knowledge that had brought him here. Every sense was tuned to the void, waiting for the first sign of the gang. The chime arrived not as a sound, but as a sharp, crystalline vibration directly against his skull. The blue panel bloomed in the corner of his vision, glowing with a steady, triumphant light. Prediction confirmed. The words burned into his retinas, followed by the rapid-fire tally of points. 500. The number swelled, filling the interface, a stark contrast to the gloom of the alley. Artyom felt the sudden, frantic relief loosen the iron band around his chest. He had been right. The logic of the script still held enough weight to be manipulated. He checked the point total again, his eyes widening as the system registered the influx. This was not just a score. It was a lifeline. He felt the cold, heavy metal of the pipe in his grip. No longer just a scrap of debris, but a tool for survival. The system pulsed, shifting its display to reflect his new standing. He was no longer just a nameless extra waiting for his end. He was a player with resources. The air in the alley seemed to thin, the suffocating pressure of his own death sentence receding. He stood taller, his stance shifting from defensive to predatory. He had the points. He had the knowledge. Now, he waited for the shadow to take shape. A new notification flickered into existence, demanding his attention. Skill acquired. Body acceleration 1. Before his mind could even process the text, a sudden, searing heat flooded his veins. It started at his spine, a sharp electric jolt that radiated outward to his fingertips and toes. Artyom gasped, his knees buckling as his muscles spasmed with an unfamiliar, rapid-fire intensity. It felt as if his blood had been replaced with liquid lightning. His heart rate tripled, drumming against his ribs like a trapped bird. He braced himself against the damp stone wall, teeth gritted, fighting to maintain balance as his internal chemistry shifted. The world around him seemed to decelerate. The slow drip of water from a nearby pipe became distinct, individual sounds. The grain of the stone wall felt rougher, more tactile under his palms. He pushed off the wall, and his body responded with a fluid, terrifying swiftness that nearly sent him careening into the mud. He caught himself, breath hitching in his throat, and looked at his trembling hands. They were steady now, anchored by a new, hummed vitality. He was no longer the frail vessel he had been minutes ago. He was primed, Calibrated and dangerous. The interface flickered, the bright blue light dimming momentarily into a deep, bruised violet. A line of text scrolled across the bottom of his vision, small and insistent. Warning. Timeline divergence detected. Probability of instability increasing. Artyom blinked, his focus pulling back for a fraction of a second. He read the words, but they felt distant, like a background hum in a crowded room. He swiped his hand through the air, dismissing the notification with a sharp, impatient flick of his wrist. His mind was not on the stability of the world. It was on the countdown. The system pulsed once more, a faint, rhythmic throbbing that bled into the edges of his sight. But he was already looking past it. He tracked the shifting dark of the warehouse entrance, his ears straining for the sound of leather on stone. The warning remained, a silent, flickering pulse in the corner of his consciousness, but he ignored it. Every instinct he possessed was locked onto the target ahead. He tightened his grip on the pipe, his knuckles white, his posture coiled. The world could wait. The timeline could wait. The only thing that mattered was the shadow beginning to detach itself from the wall. The heavy iron bell in the city center tolled once, then twice. 12 times. The reverberation hummed through the soles of his boots and rattled the loose shutters of the nearby huts. As the final echo died, the air in the alley seemed to thicken, turning cold and stagnant. Artyom pressed his spine against the rough masonry, his lungs barely drawing in air. He did not move. He did not blink. The darkness within the warehouse doorway surged. It was not a natural shift of shadows, but a calculated, deliberate movement. 3 figures detached themselves from the gloom. They moved in perfect synchronization, their boots striking the stone with a rhythmic, metallic clatter that felt like a countdown. As they stepped into the sliver of moonlight filtering between the buildings, the dull gray of their blades caught the light. The steel was stained, uneven, and hungry. They stopped 10 paces away, their faces obscured by the deep folds of their hoods. The leader shifted, the leather of his shoulder guard creaking in the silence. They were here. The script had finally begun to unfold, and the weight of their intent pressed against Artyom like a physical wall. Artyom felt the blood drain from his face as the lead figure tilted his head. He knew that movement. He knew the jagged scar running across the man's chin, a detail he had stared at for hours on his phone screen. These were the Black Ravens. They were not supposed to be real. They were ink and paper, a plot device designed to end the life of a nameless extra in the first chapter of a digital story. Yet, the metallic stench of their blades was sharp and undeniable. The leader took a step forward, his boot crushing a loose pebble with a sound that echoed like a hammer strike. Artyom's mind raced, scrolling through pages of memory, matching every stance and every subtle shift of weight to the panels he had memorized. There was no room for error. The script dictated his expiration at this exact location, by these exact hands. Fear, cold and heavy, settled in his marrow, but beneath it, a desperate resolve ignited. He wasn't just a reader anymore. He was the variable. He gripped the pipe until his fingers cramped, his pulse drumming a frantic rhythm against his skin as the leader raised his hand, signaling the final approach. The system chime was a sharp crystalline sound that cut through the impending violence. Artyom didn't hesitate. He willed the command into the void. Activate. Body acceleration. Instantly, the world fractured. The rhythm of the lead killer's footsteps slowed to a crawl, the sound stretching into a low, guttural vibration. The falling dust motes suspended in the moonlight became distinct, floating islands of debris. Artyom felt a surge of raw, kinetic energy ignite in his core, but it was violent and unrefined. His perception had outpaced his biology. He tried to shift his weight, to lunge forward, but his limbs felt like leaden weights tethered to a frantic mind. Every muscle fiber screamed under the sudden, unnatural strain. He was moving, but his control was fraying at the edges. He pushed against the inertia, his own breath sounding like a roar in the unnervingly silent street. The power was there, pulsating through his veins, yet it felt alien and reckless. He was a passenger in his own skin, riding a surge of speed that threatened to tear him apart before it even touched the enemy. He surged forward, but his balance was a ghost. The acceleration hit like a physical blow. Artyom lunged, but his legs moved with a velocity his brain could not track. The ground blurred into a smear of gray stone and shadow. He meant to pivot, to strike with precision, but his lead foot caught on an uneven patch of earth. His center of gravity vanished. He was no longer a fighter. He was a projectile. The world tilted sideways as he lost all control, his arms flailing to find purchase in the empty air. He plummeted forward, his momentum carrying him into the dark periphery of the alley. A heavy wooden beam, supporting the eaves of a nearby shack, loomed in his path. He slammed into it face first with a sickening, hollow thud that echoed through the alley. The impact jarred his teeth and sent a shockwave of pain through his skull. He sprawled across the dirt, breathless and disoriented, his forehead pulsing with white-hot heat. He had failed to execute the move, failed to be the hero, but the violence of his fall was so erratic, so entirely outside the script of a calculated attack, that the shadows stopped dead in their tracks. Dust motes danced in the moonlight as Artyom lay motionless, the metallic tang of blood filling his throat. The alley went deathly quiet. The three men in the shadows stood frozen, their blades half-drawn, eyes wide with genuine bewilderment. They had anticipated a desperate struggle or a frantic flight, not a self-inflicted collision with a support beam. The leader tilted his head, his hand hesitating on the hilt of his weapon as he scanned the darkness for a trap. Was this a ruse? A calculated feint designed to lure them into a false sense of security? They shifted their weight, stepping back instinctively, their professional rhythm shattered by the sheer stupidity of the opening move. Artyom groaned, his fingers clawing at the dirt, his body a map of throbbing pain. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. One of the thugs muttered something, a harsh, jagged sound that died before it could fully form. They were waiting for him to rise, waiting for the hidden counter, not realizing he was just as confused as they were. This was the opening, a heartbeat of hesitation that neither side expected. The gap between expectation and reality was the only thing keeping him alive, and for those few seconds, the alley held its breath. Artyom forced his eyes open. The world spun, but the threat remained, etched in the silhouettes of the three men. He did not think. He scrambled. His hand brushed against cold, flaking metal buried in the refuse. A rusted pipe. He gripped it, the iron rough against his palm, and surged upward with a guttural, jagged cry. There was no finesse, no tactical brilliance, only the blinding, animal need to not die. He swung the pipe in a wide, erratic arc that whistled through the stagnant alley air. The leader dodged, but the pipe clipped his shoulder with a wet, bone-jarring crack. The sound broke the spell of the night. Artyom did not stop. He lunged forward, his feet sliding on the slick ground, swinging the pipe again and again at anything within reach. He was a whirlwind of clumsy, desperate strikes, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The thugs recoiled, their professional composure shattered by the sheer, unhinged ferocity of the boy. They had come for a victim, not a brawler. Artyom slammed the pipe against the stone wall, sparks flying, and leveled the weapon at the remaining two. He was shaking, bleeding, and utterly terrified, but he was still standing. The leader of the thugs spat into the dust, his eyes narrowing as he regained his balance. He stepped forward, his blade held low, preparing a diagonal strike that Artyom had watched 1,000 times on his phone screen. In the original script, this was the moment the protagonist fell. Artyom felt the system pulse behind his eyes, a rapid, rhythmic flickering of data. He saw the shift in the leader's weight, the slight dip of the left heel, the tension coiling in the forearm. It was identical to the animation loop. He knew exactly where the steel would bite. The blade whistled through the air, aimed directly at his throat. Artyom moved before the swing reached its apex. He didn't just dodge, he stepped into the blind spot created by the leader's momentum. The cold air of the blade grazed his skin, missing by a fraction of an inch. He felt the vacuum of the passing steel. The system chime echoed in his skull, a sharp metallic ping of synchronization. He was no longer reacting to an attack. He was countering a memory. The thug's eyes widened, the realization hitting him that his predictability was now his greatest weakness. Artyom stood firm, his lungs burning, his focus locked entirely on the next movement in the sequence. The leader was committed to his swing, his momentum carrying him forward into a trap he did not yet understand. Artyom did not hesitate. He pivoted on his lead foot, shifting his weight to drive the full force of his body through the rusted pipe. The impact was absolute. Metal met bone with a sickening, wet thud that echoed off the damp alley walls. The leader's shoulder crumpled under the force, his arm going limp as the pipe tore through the resistance. He stumbled backward, his feet scraping frantically against the uneven cobblestones, his eyes wide with a confusion that transcended physical pain. The air in the alley seemed to stutter. Artyom felt a violent vibration in his mind as the system flooded his vision with rapid, scrolling red text. The script had been broken. The predefined outcome of this encounter, the defeat of the nameless extra, had been erased by a single, heavy strike. The leader clawed at his ruined shoulder, gasping, his blade clattering to the ground with a sharp final metallic ring. Artyom stood over him, chest heaving, his knuckles white against the pipe. The silence that followed was not the quiet of the night. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a timeline being rewritten in real time. The leader slumped against the brickwork, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. The two remaining thugs stood paralyzed. They had come to execute a nameless target, a scripted death they had performed countless times before. But the target was not dead. The target was standing with a rusted pipe in hand, chest heaving, eyes burning with a defiance that defied their understanding of the world. They stared at the leader, then at Artyom, their certainty dissolving into raw, primitive fear. One of the thugs reached for his blade, his hand trembling so violently that the metal rattled against his palm. He looked at the leader, then back at the alley entrance. The script had failed them. The predictability of the night had been replaced by a brutal, unknown variable. Without a word, the thug turned and bolted, his boots slamming against the wet stones. The third man hesitated for a heartbeat, his gaze lingering on the broken leader, before he too scrambled away, vanishing into the darkness of the maze-like streets. Their frantic breathing faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of dripping water and the leader's ragged gasps. The alley fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. Artyom did not move, his grip on the pipe remaining tight, watching the shadows where the attackers had disappeared. The echoes of fleeing footsteps died out, leaving the alley to the cold, encroaching damp. Artyom stayed anchored to the spot, his muscles locking in a rigid, involuntary spasm. The rusted pipe slipped from his fingers, clanging against the cobblestones with a sound that seemed deafening in the sudden void. He watched the leader slumped against the wall, the man's breathing shallow and ragged, but the immediate threat had disintegrated. Artyom's own lungs burned. Every inhale felt like drawing in shards of frozen glass, yet he forced himself to stand upright. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, not from exhaustion, but from the raw, buzzing feedback of adrenaline beginning to recede. He wiped sweat and grime from his forehead, his skin clammy against the night air. The city around him remained indifferent, the distant sound of a stray dog barking marking the passage of time. He was still here. He was still breathing. The weight of the pipe was gone, but the weight of the reality he had just forged sat heavy in his gut. He took a slow, deliberate step away from the wall, his boots crunching on loose grit, testing the firmness of the ground beneath him. The night was no longer a script. It was a map he had just begun to redraw. The silence of the alley was shattered by a sharp, melodic chime that vibrated directly against his skull. Before his eyes, the air coalesced, knitting together into a glowing blue panel that hovered in the dark. Artyom blinked, his vision straining to focus on the sharp white text. Success. The word pulsed with a steady, rhythmic light. A cascade of notifications began to scroll rapidly down the screen. Quest complete. Survive until dawn. Reward. 100 knowledge points. He felt a sudden, electric tingle crawl up his spine. A sensation of static electricity arcing through his nerves. His heart, previously hammering with fear, now drummed with a cold, calculated rhythm. The system tallied his total, the numbers spinning like a frantic clock before settling at 590. He was no longer just a nameless extra. He was a variable with value. The exhaustion that had been dragging at his limbs evaporated, replaced by a sharp, clear-headed focus. He felt a surge of energy, a physical manifestation of the points he had earned. He clenched his fist, watching the faint blue light reflect off his skin. For the first time, he did not just feel like a player in a game. He felt like the one holding the controller. He pushed away from the alley walls, leaving the scene of his first victory behind. The city was a maze of jagged silhouettes and deep shadows, but his eyes were no longer those of a victim. He found a drainage pipe, gripped the cold iron, and hauled himself upward. His muscles burned with a new, efficient heat, the lingering effect of the points he had spent. He crested the edge of the roof, his boots scraping against loose tiles, and pulled himself into the open air. Below, the market district was a sprawling grid of quiet huts and dark paths. From this height, the layout of the world looked different. It was no longer a script to be followed, it was a geography to be conquered. He walked to the very edge of the eaves, the wind whipping his hair, and looked down at the streets where he had nearly died just hours ago. He felt the city pulsing beneath him, a living, breathing entity that he now understood. He breathed in the night air, deep and slow. For the first time, he was not reacting to the world. He was observing it. He was the architect of his own survival, and as he stared out into the vast, dark horizon, he felt the intoxicating certainty that he could rewrite every line of this story. The feeling of absolute control lasted exactly 3 seconds. Without warning, the blue light reflecting off his skin warped. The calm, steady interface began to stutter. Rows of text flickered, collapsing into illegible, jagged lines of static. A low-frequency hum resonated through his jaw, growing louder until it became a physical pressure against his eardrums. He reached out to touch the air, but his hand passed through the light, which had turned a violent, pulsing crimson. It was not the soft glow of a reward anymore. It was the harsh, warning strobe of a critical failure. The air around him seemed to thicken, the temperature plummeting as the system screen expanded, aggressively pushing aside his field of vision. Each pulse of red light cast long, distorted shadows across the rooftop. A new notification hammered into his mind, the letters bleeding together in a frantic, glitching display. The sense of triumph that had fueled his climb evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow sensation in his gut. He was no longer looking at a game map. He was looking at a broken machine. Something had gone wrong, something fundamental, and the system was screaming its alarm into the quiet night. He stepped back, his breath hitching as the crimson light burned into his eyes, signaling an error that the script had never accounted for. He forced his eyes to focus on the jagged, shifting text. The notification was blunt. Warning. Timeline divergence, level 1. NPC Lin Xiao has altered his path due to your intervention. Original event, encounter with the Master cancelled. The words burned into his retinas. He felt his pulse thrumming in his fingertips. Lin Xiao, the boy who was supposed to find the Heavenly Dragon artifact in the southern ruins. He stared at the empty space where the hero should have been. If Lin Xiao never found that artifact, the hero would never gain the power needed to seal the void. The entire world, the entire plot he had memorized, relied on that singular, fragile moment of discovery. By surviving, by simply existing where he should have been a corpse, he had knocked the keystone from the arch. The system continued to pulse, its red light throwing his own face into sharp, terrified relief against the dark tiles. He was not just a player anymore. He was a virus in the machine, and the machine was failing. The foundation of the world he knew was crumbling beneath his feet, and the silence of the city felt heavier, colder, and more final than it ever had before. He had saved himself, but in doing so, he had doomed everything else. Artyom looked down at his own hands. They were steadying themselves against the rough edge of the chimney, but they were the same hands that had struck the leader of the Black Ravens. Those hands had altered a sequence, moved a piece, and now the board was empty. He was holding the hammer that had shattered the world's only hope, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. The system display flickered one last time, the crimson light bathing the rooftop in a color that felt like drying blood. He realized then that his knowledge was not a gift, but a death sentence for everyone else in this reality. Every action he took to survive only pushed the world further into the abyss of an unwritten, lawless future. The wind picked up, pulling at his hair, but he did not move. He could not. The realization was absolute, cold, and suffocating. He had won his life, but he had lost the world. He stood in the center of the dark, silent city, a survivor of a story that no longer had an ending, waiting for the consequences of his existence to finally catch up to him.